One of the big issues that farmers will have if they don't raise a crop on a field for a particular year or have anything growing in that field is they'll get something called fallow syndrome. And what it really amounts to, what fallow syndrome really is the fact that you've had beneficial bacteria and especially beneficial fungi in the soil die. The problem with that is many of these bacteria and fungi can help bring nutrients into plants. It's crazy how our soil works and all the stuff that's going on in the soil, but just because you have fertilizer out there doesn't mean it's going to get into the plant.
Well, in some drier areas of the country, farmers will intentionally fallow, trying to store up enough moisture over a 2-year time period to be able to raise one crop, for example. And that's fine for gathering moisture. The challenge for those guys is oftentimes that we end up with some fallow syndrome out there. We don't have crops growing for all that soil life to be feeding on. So in some cases, those farmers are switching out of that rotation, trying to raise a crop every year, or at least using a cover crop out there in times where they don't get a crop planted. That way they can try and keep the soil life going. We saw the same thing this year in areas that had excessive rain across southern Minnesota, northern Iowa. Some guys that had always planted a crop, had never had a year they couldn't get the crop in. Well, this was the year they couldn't get all their acres in. And so many of those guys put a cover crop in, just trying to keep that soil life going out in their field to avoid having a fallow syndrome issue.
And that's great, but they're probably still going to have a little bit of an issue because when soil sits with too much water, that means it has no oxygen. So if you've got a very high water table all the way up to the soil surface, and in fact it's flooded out with no oxygen down in that soil profile, pretty soon any plants that were there die. A lot of bacteria, some of the fungi, some of the beneficial things, beneficial insects even, or earthworms that are in your soil, some of those things are going to start to die off. That's bad, and you can't replenish those in just a couple of months with a cover crop, but it really will help.
Well, here's the challenge though, Brian, is what kind of value do we put on those little bacteria and fungi out in soils, because we just don't understand them completely yet. However, we are starting to understand certain strains of them that work in the soil. Like for soybeans, for example. Guys that raise soybeans every other year or every year, they may say, you know, I have a lot of the rhizobia bacteria that I need to make nodules on my roots out in my soil. I may not get as much of a benefit out of inoculant and inoculating those soybean seeds that I'm planting every year. I disagree with that thinking, but there are quite a few people that believe that, because there will be some of those bacteria that will be out in the soil at a certain level, and you still will see nodulation on your beans. But when we have this fallow syndrome, we see a greatly reduced nodulation on the soybean roots, and this is a spot where inoculant could pay even more than it normally would. The job of those bacteria is to take nitrogen from the air and bring that into our soybean plants so we don't have to apply all that nitrogen plant food out in our fields.
Well, we as farmers really don't understand all this soil life stuff going on. We know it's important. There actually are some tests out there that can be run to see your overall soil life and overall soil health. Midwest Labs, for example, out of Omaha, we do our soil testing there. They've got a test that, you know, I'll be honest, we've never even run it on our farm on a regular basis, but we've seen a couple of tests and we say, oh, that is kind of interesting. Maybe we're going to have to start thinking about testing that more. But especially we would test it if we had flooded soils, if we had fallowed soils. That's what we're most interested in. Now, if you want to build that soil life back up again, we encourage you to use some biological products, whether it's inoculant or there are other beneficial bacteria and fungi products out there. You can also put some manure out. Again, we encourage you to do some cover crops. And above all else, you got to go into the season thinking, you know what, I may have my normal levels of P and K and all these other nutrients in the soil. I'm going to bump that up 10% more than normal just to be on the safe side, because otherwise we've seen way too many times where the corn turns purple or the corn turns yellow or something happens bad to your plant early in the season that you don't want to have happen because of fallow syndrome.
And you know what's funny too, Brian, is sometimes those areas of the field where crop doesn't grow, we still have plenty of weeds growing out there, like our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?